Hey, welcome back to this month's edition of Spirit Talk. It is May 2016. I have to share something with you. Just realized last month that it has been 10 years since we have been doing Spirit Talk. This is our 10-year anniversary. That's over 80 podcasts. I never imagined it would go this long. I never did. But thanks to everybody listening and our growing fan base, that we have continued to bring you incredible guests, incredible stories, experiences, spiritual and paranormal matters that not only impact our lives, but also create awareness to consciousness and who we are in the world we live in and the world we are unaware of. So I want to thank you for being. So I want to thank you for listening to Spirit Talk over all these years. And if you're new to listening to Spirit Talk, thank you for joining us. You know, when I first started, I had a really interesting intro to Spirit Talk, and I'd like to play that for you. But since then, it has evolved with different forms of music, and the one we've been using over the past few years is original music created by a good friend of mine, Johnny Rico. Johnny used to be in a hard rock, heavy metal glam band called Warrior Soul. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, opened up for Iron Maiden, Queensryche, Metallica. He has toured with some of the top bands, and he had a record contract with Geffen Records. I think they did about 6 records. Incredible, talented individual, and he's a great friend of mine. And I want to pay homage to the fact that he created the music for Spirit Talk. But here's an interesting intro. I want to play this for some of you that have never heard this, since this is our 10-year anniversary. This is the original intro that I had created for Spirit Talk.
They're here. There's a monster outside my room. Can I have a glass of water? I see dead people.
Please hang up and try again.
And you take the believe that I ought to begin. What are we to do?
Terror unanswered can not only bring down buildings, it can threaten the stability of legitimate governments.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
And you know what? We're not going to allow it.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
Free at last! Free at last! God Almighty! We are free at last!
But I can only show you the door. You're the one that has to walk through it.
Woo, there you go. That was our intro when we started doing Spirit Talk. Man, that gives me chills when I still listen to that. Some of the greatest speakers of our time that talked about truth, as well as those that try to keep the truth from us. That's kind of what this podcast is all about and always been about, is like, you know what? We've got individuals that they may not have any fame, any status, any financial, but yet they have discovered, uncovered, or experienced some remarkable things about who we truly are. And that's why I do this podcast. So I want to thank everybody, you, the fans, and everybody out there that has taken the time to stick with me over the past 10 years and listen to this show. Now, before we get to our next guest, I do want to share with you, I also have a couple websites. One of the websites is ghostoutlet.com, where I've been selling ghost hunting equipment, collectibles, and rare items since 2007. If you didn't know about it, please check it out. It's at ghostoutlet.com. And also, my personal website is almost complete. It's online now. It's called ChristopherFleming.com. please check that out. If you're looking at booking readings, spirit art, want to know where I'll be next speaking or my appearances, as well as some helpful information on there, you can go to ChristopherFleming.com. Now let's get to our guest for this month on Spirit Talk. Our guest this month is an experiencer, an author, and an international speaker on the topics of alien contact, the Moorish Legacy, human origins, and related matters. He's received high honors at New York State University for his dedicated work with extraterrestrial intervention, as well as alien abduction phenomena. Now, he's written 2 books, The Moor, the Mason, and the Alien, A Call to Action, and Legions of Light, Armies of Darkness. And he's globally recognized for spearheading the human origins revolution. Now, he currently resides in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he's working on his 3rd book. Please welcome to the show, Richard Smith. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris, for having me on the show. It's great to be here.
No, thank you. And it's wonderful to have you on because you and I got a little bit of a history, going back to the late 90s when I was publishing my magazine, and we had a mutual friend that we corresponded with, K.T. Frankovich.
Oh, yes, I remember, yes.
Regarding, for those that don't know, she had a alien contact encounter in the lime grove, which we believe is either some type of gray or hybrid gray that she had an experience with. And Rich and I had spoke about, alien contact back then, some of the experiences, and Rich did some of the artwork that illustrated KT's experience. But we also met up at the Clearwater UFO conference back in, I don't know if that was 99 or 2000, and we got to enjoy our hobbies as well as our own experiences and sharing that. But I want to welcome you to this show because I've been watching over the years and seeing how you've been writing some of these books, talking about your experience and knowledge that you've received. And I said, you know what, let's have him on Spirit Talk so we can discuss about, some of the books you wrote, which you're working on now, but also gray aliens, the alien agenda, and what you've learned about that type of phenomena. But before we begin, I have to ask this. Let's refresh myself,
okay,
but also for my listeners, because some of them may not know anything about you. The one question they're always going to ask is, you're an experiencer. Can you share with us any forms of experience that you've had regarding this type of phenomena?
Yes, I can. And what's funny is that in the new book that I just put out recently, The Moor, the Mason, and the Alien, in the beginning of the book, I outline the new 10 commandments for the 21st century as to what people have the right to ask and what they don't. For the sake of interviews, I tend to be a lot more flexible about that because it is an interview. But I tend to tell people, if I was having a discussion with a seminar or a lecture, I would say I'm mostly here to talk about the lessons learned about the experience, but when the lesson crosses over into explaining the actual experience, then I'll be happy to do that. Outside of that, it's a privacy issue, and It would be no different if I asked you what kind of kinky sex you like to have with your wife behind closed doors, okay? So,
yeah.
But that being said, over the years, since the age of 21, and just to put that in perspective, I'm 45 now, okay? So since the age of 21, there's been some pretty interesting experiences, both educational, enlightening, and some of them nightmarish and hostile, just purely out of an act of sometimes retaliation or jealousy, because you got to figure, and there's probably a lot of people with your listenership with the gist of theme of the radio show Spirit Talk. I have framed this as a spiritual insurrection across the planet, a global movement against what is essentially a corporate materialism, which we often characterize as the alien agenda, okay? And so these two, are polar opposites with each other, and of course, the guy caught in the middle is the human race. And so one represents, giving the human race a chance to fight back. The other represents, what's been going on in terms of enslaving the mind. And so you've got these two polar opposite things going on here. In my personal experiences, I talk about, I do actually talk about some of them in the book too, but as time goes on with the book I'm working on now and so forth, I'll get more into them in detail. But I had the first awakening that I referred to, and I often talk about at the age of 21, this extraterrestrial being who I refer to as the crone in a lot of my writings. She is very much like, and I actually, this book that's out now, I actually describe her in detail for the first time. And because a lot of people had been asking about that over the years, and I would just usually bring it up in lectures. I was like, you know what? I am going to sit down and I'm going to describe and give people a good understanding as to what she looks like. And basically, as I've always said, she's a rather tall female praying mantis type being, also known as the ancient healers. And there's very few of her left out there because she's kind of like the, part of the primordial ooze of the universe itself. Her race is so old. But it also, she is part of a group I refer to as the Sisterhood or the Sisters of Mercy. And it's a multi-genotype collection, mostly female. You will find some, male entities in there too, but mostly female, dealing with the very essence of the Vril energy. And they act as, in many cases, as far as the human race goes, they act as midwives, between extraterrestrial intervention and reincarnation and all these things here. And they have taken it upon themselves as a responsibility to at least remain vigilant on whether or not the bad guys are crossing the line too much. I get into details as to how this plays into our history on this planet with the evolution of the Temple of Solomon and the bloodline of the Christs and the Star of David, and how they have taken a sense of guardianship over that, as well as how this translates into today's terms. Today we refer to them as indigos or super psychic kids or so forth, or just teachers of the masses, people who are taking downloaded information and passing it on to the general public in lectures and seminars and teaching people. And so, of course, these people tend to have a target painted on the back of their head once they take on that responsibility. For me, the crone has always been there as part of my family and goes back several generations, including my mother and my grandmother. So when they talk about these things being generational, my family history gives that a whole new meaning. And it's not necessarily like in the abduction phenomenon, they refer to it as generational because people are being tagged like salmon. For me, it's generational because I've had this female presence there that my grandmother and my mother were a part of. And of course, in my generation in the family, there were no girls, so it basically got put on me as the eldest of 5 grandchildren. So that's where it went from there, from the age of 21. And so it starts out with the artwork, gradually evolves into, getting braver and braver along the way in the early to late 90s of getting up in front of a crowd and talking, and then of course evolves into the writing. And by the time 2005 comes along, all of a sudden it's a brand new ball game, and it's the official beginning of the human origins revolution. And I also talk about that in the book, as to how that evolved. And so it's one part experience, one part lesson learned and knowledge and wisdom and information, and how the two interplay with each other, both personally for me, in my family, and historically with the entire human race as the larger family. So that's where it goes with the experiences. As far as the other side of the equation, since you brought up the alien agenda, there's been plenty of times where, people who just don't, pay attention and heed the lesson, they're always going to make attempts at coming at you.
Right.
I had one particular experience years ago. I was working on a piece of artwork in the studio, and a entity of a reptilian persuasion came at me while I was in the studio, pinned me against the wall, or at least tried to, with his own mind, and said, "We know what you've been doing, boy, and now we want you to do it for us." And I told him, I said,
Wow.
You better get your hands off me. You're not supposed to be here. And I said, you are crossing a line. And at that point, all of a sudden I dropped from the wall, stood up on my legs, and honestly, not knowing any better, I thought it was me doing it. It really wasn't. There was this hand, or it looked like a hand, that came over my head, a few feet above my head, and all of a sudden it was like attached to a giant shadow behind me. The reptilian entity, what I refer to as a drock, a sentinel, all of a sudden was, eviscerated, torn limb from limb. Entrails were now outside instead of inside, and was sent back through a vortex back to wherever the hell it came from. I turned around, and sure enough, it was the crone. I said I should have known it wasn't me. And so, of course, I'm 6'2". She towers over me an extra several feet. I mean, sometimes she looks like she's 9 feet. Sometimes she looks like she's 12 feet. Okay. And I looked at her and I said, what the hell was that all about? And she said, well, like we've had in all of our discussions, they'll keep trying because they're persistent. But I said, but she told me, she says, this will send a message back to them that this is a hands-off policy and no one is allowed to come after you.
God, it's just incredible. You sit here, I'm listening to you, and I'm getting all the visuals in my head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And here's the thing. I'm going to say this straight out, to my listeners, is I completely do believe in the reptilian race. I believe there are various races that have been coming to this planet, as well as other planets, for longer than we could even imagine. And you're talking about these reptilians, and, I did a lot of research on this back in the 90s. I was publishing my magazine.
Mm-hmm.
People I know that I've talked to, individuals that have been attacked by these things. So there's no doubt to me when we go throughout history, even in the Bible, a serpent's walking upright, talking.
Oh, yeah.
And then all of a sudden, come on, people. In many different cultures, they talk about worshiping these snake gods and these reptilians. So there has to be something to this that is true.
Oh, yeah. And
go ahead. You have these experiences, and I can understand how it can be uncomfortable in talking about some of them. It's things that aren't uncomfortable are the experiences and the lessons that you get from them. And, you have some questions that, you want during these interviews people to ask you. And I looked over some of the questions, and they're pertaining to what you've written about and what you've experienced. And the very first one caught me, intrigued me. And the question is here that I want to ask you is, you ever wonder how we got ourselves into this bottom feeder existence we call civilization, this existence we call civilization? And the people don't realize is that we are spiritual beings. We are souls that come here and we have an experience within this body, within this vehicle, and we've created for ourselves within this timeline, within this dimension, civilizations. Civilizations come and go. They rise and fall. But we create this for ourselves to have these experiences. What's interesting is about a week ago during a reading, a woman says, my dad doesn't believe in the afterlife. He says it doesn't exist. So I ask them on the other side, and they say right to me, tell her to ask her father, what is existence?
Right.
And to them, yes. They say existence is many lives, many places, many locations. And it's not just Earth. It's not just, one timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're talking about here is, I'd like to open that up for discussion, is we sometimes don't realize we are kind of like the bottom feeders.
Yeah. It goes back to the whole idea of who made who. Did the individual create the society, or did the society create the individual? And where's the third silent party playing both sides against the middle? It's quite plainly what we call today the Matrix. and the ability for you to create your own reality. Native Americans, going back to what you said before about multiple, existences and so forth, Native Americans have always referred to it as multiple streams of time, okay, not just one, everything happening at once. And the fact that even something you had described earlier about, when maybe abductees who are getting regressed and they go 20 years ago to an experience they had, but they're talking about it as if it happened 5 minutes ago. That's the streams of time, because it's all based on the mind just shifting the universe around it. And we have this idea that, and it's not a bad idea as long as it's short-term travel, but we have this idea stuck in our head that you have to jump in a metal rocket of some sort and go from point A to point B, and point B is 180,000 miles away, and holy cow, how do I get there? 1 million miles away, okay? 50 billion miles away. And yet, the fact of the matter is that that's nice, if you're going from planet to planet inside your own solar system. But the truth of the matter is, if you want to cover long distances, it's really thought technology, thought travel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And this is what gets into, well, who's controlling the matrix, who's keeping you enslaved in mind and body, and economically, therefore. Because the economics of it is the environment around you, okay? But spiritually, it affects you internally. Because if you can destroy the mind first, then you can destroy the body collectively. And that's why these things are intentionally targeted. Because God forbid, the grand vision of the human experiment is ever allowed to wake up. In other words, the other 80% that really doesn't know what's going on. I'm not talking about the 20%. They'll just do just fine. I'm talking about the other 80% that's still walking around in a coma, okay? God forbid everyone should be able to wake up at once. There'd be no way, even though our bodies would still be physically here on the planet, there'd be no way to entrap us at that point, because we could go anywhere we want. Shirley MacLaine proved this years ago, back in the 80s, when she talked about her experiences just simply on the level of astral projection, as one example, one basic fundamental example. And the only thing that stunted her was when she got out into space, she looked at a particular galaxy, whole galaxy, and the thing that messed her up was when she asked herself, oh, I wonder if I can go there. Bam, she was back in her body, and it was all taken away from her because she asked the doubtful question. And, it's human nature. She didn't do anything wrong, but that's one small example. Now, if she and the rest of us, any of us, could do that to ourselves by accident, then imagine what's been done on purpose for the last 500,000 years with all due intent to keep us under the thumb of the corporate titans of Orion. So, that's...
Tell me about this. Two things that you're saying for listeners that may or may not understand is Richard's talking about, consciousness, thought projection. I speak a lot about this in my lectures, and I've talked about this in the past, is we are not limited to our thoughts, our consciousness. What is limited is our understanding of it within this realm, within what we're being taught, with what we're being showed, is that the mind, the consciousness itself, can go great distances, for there actually is no distance. We just believe there is. The reality that's been created around us, this environment in three-dimensional form, creates the existence for this experience that there is distance. But yet when you go beyond that and you observe it and you see it from a different perspective, you realize that there really is no distance because our thoughts can go anywhere. And I think that's what you're trying to share.
Yeah, definitely. Because imagine, if you will, what would happen if, it would be no different if you went back to the 1800s and you taught a slave how to read. All of a sudden they knew what a sentence was, a noun, a verb, an adjective. All of a sudden they could read the signs around them. All of a sudden they knew how to get off the plantation, and they knew how to read the signs, how to get to, the northern states. Okay? Getting to the northern states is like us going to Andromeda, okay, for a slave. And it's the same example. Same thing with, and in reverse, we were there. Okay, we represent the grand experiment that was turned into the Great Fall during the last patriarchal invasion of this entire solar system, when all the carpetbaggers and robber barons came running from the four corners of the galaxy to make a profit once they found out that there was, a preordained, built-in cheap slave race that was already in existence and on its way to full consciousness. And the bad guys were like, well, screw that. We're going to stop that consciousness dead in its tracks. We've got perfect slaves built into the planetary system. We need to make a profit. We're going to use them because they're indigenous, and that would be us. Well, the same thing happened in reverse when all that was taken away from the consciousness of Native Americans who were in communion with Mother Earth, and then all of a sudden you're taking them and sticking them back on the plantation or the reservation and saying, here, this little limited piece of garbage, piece of land is your reality now. And that is what destroyed their capability to carry on their legacy and stay in touch with, Mother Earth.
Yeah.
So it's happened in reverse to the human race as a whole. We had our entire legacy as proprietors, owners, and caretakers of this entire solar system, which in esoteric literature is called a kingdom. Whenever you see the word kingdom in esoteric or religious literature, it's talking about an entire solar system. And we had that taken away from us, and we were turned back into property of the land that was being mined or hydrofracked or strip mined, okay? We were turned back into the property of the land. So there was a whole reversal of psychology there, and all of a sudden we became like codependent drug addicts. Oh my God, it's I belong to this, I belong to that, and then of course this is what creates the psychology of the ego to say, well, if I'm going to be a master of my own destiny, I got to take everything, okay? And this is what results in the selfish mentality of me, mine, because of the fear and paranoia that came before that when the legacy was taken away.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, you talk about, with the Indians and relationship to nature. Now, what is the covenant of Gaia, and how did these visitors, these extraterrestrial visitors, play into this?
The covenant of Gaia is that Earth is actually the throne of power, as is the case in any solar system. There's always one planet that's considered the throne of power, and therefore all other planets are behooven to belong to that throne of power as pieces of, property, real estate investing, as I get into it in the book there, okay? Because it's all based on economics and real estate investing. That is the backbone of a lot of the alien agenda there. And then all this other stuff trickles down from it, all the ooga booga hocus pocus stuff of how do we scare the hell out of the slaves? Well, let's abduct them and start experimenting on them. And all that comes after the fact. The covenant of Gaia is that it is the Moorish legacy. It is the true birthright of the human race that is the true caretakers, inheritors, and owners and rightful heirs to the throne, and therefore the entire solar system. It is the bloodline of the Christs, as such, which was started as a spiritual insurrection to regain that throne of power and give it back to the human race. Gaia is another reference to Mother Earth, obviously, just like Eridu, which is a reference to the ancient kingdom, and so is Tiamat. I use these words in the book there, back and forth. And I talk about in the book there that the covenant of Gaia was signed in the blood of the ancients to start bringing back people, starting in the 1970s, reincarnating them back onto the planet as teachers of the masses, to start gaining ground against the abuses and the atrocities of crimes against humanity that are being blatantly committed and have been committed for eons by these corporate elements that come from a couple of very ancient empires that only cooperate together for the sole purpose of greed.
Mm-hmm.
And, and the people often say, well, what about the good guys? I was like, you are the good guy, okay? You are the alien that came back in human form, okay? You are the good guy. So get used to it because you're the one on the front line of the battle. And the benevolent factions, I talk about them in the book. One of them obviously is the Sisterhood. The other one I refer to is the Ankyls. And I talk about the significance of the Ankyls in terms of giving us a sense of self-awareness with the gene for passion, the genetic code, gene for passion. And I tell people that in terms of the spiritual insurrection, when the gene for passion or the genetic code that says, I think, therefore I am, when that passed through the Temple of Solomon and came out the other side, it became known as the Passion of the Christ or the Kundalini. Okay? And this is what begins the Moorish Legacy as a spiritual insurrection against the Greys, against the shadow government, against what I refer to in the book as the Chateau regime, who have been put by proxy in charge of the solar system by what I refer to in the book and I explain as the Sata queens, the white, pale-skinned reptilian queens who represent the elite of the empire of the Arians, or Orion, as we get by mispronunciation. So this is where the battle lines are being drawn, okay? And and we're getting there little by little, okay? We are getting closer and closer to waking up. And people often talk about this thing which has been sorely abused and misunderstood called the Prime Directive. And I'm like, yeah, the good guys follow that. But that's why they had to institute this idea of sending people into the gene pool as teachers of the masses to spread the word, because they had to take a hands-off policy. So it's 6 1/2 in the other. Are they not getting involved, or are they? You could argue it both ways, but they had to do something, because the bad guys were basically just raping and molesting the Prime Directive left and right. Why? Because 80% of the population is asleep, and if they're asleep, then no one gets caught doing it. You're only violating the law if you actually get caught doing it. And that's how the bad guys get away with it. Once the human race wakes up and takes a stand against them and says, we know what you've done to us, we know what you've been doing, we know what you're going to do, and we demand that you stop, pack up your stuff, and leave. And at that point, once we make that conscious decision as a global planet, okay, without all these ridiculous country borders, then and only then will the benevolent factions step in to create a stalemate against the bad guys and force their hand to leave.
For all this, and it seems like this might get very complicated in understanding exactly how all this works, for certain listeners that may not believe in aliens and this and that, what's going on in the invisible, in the universe, outside of our normal consciousness and understanding? Now, as many people on this planet believe that we are the only ones. We are the center of the universe, that there is no other thing that's been created but us. There is no creator. We just came right out of the ocean or part of evolution and just threw out chaos or whatever we exist. What would you say to those people? How would you, it'd be difficult, but how would you explain to them to say, hey, listen, no, there are other beings, and, how would you explain it to them?
I would tell them to stop. I would tell them to stop hedging their bets on arguing against religion. Anyone can argue against religion, and start looking at the new science. You can't argue against the new science, okay? And new science dictates quite clearly how and why a multiverse exists, an omniverse, and how and why the human race was not an accident, was created with all due intent, all, good, bad, or good, the good, the bad, and the ugly, whatever the intentions were. And, that because of frequency and energy, things that can be tangibly proven by science these days, that reincarnation is a reality. And if it's a reality, then, I tell people, I said, do you really think I always looked like this? Okay. I didn't always look like a white Anglo-Saxon heterosexual male. I used to be black. I used to be female. And if I used to be black, Hispanic, or Native American, then guess what? I also used to have green, purple, and yellow skin. Okay. I used to have 3 eyes. Okay. Maybe I had 4 arms. I don't know. But the idea that the universe is constantly expanding at a hyper rapid rate and hasn't slowed down. Okay. So logically, that's a whole lot of space out there being wasted. And it's already been proven by new science that this universe favors life. Okay. Now, if it favors life, then carbon-based life forms are abundant everywhere in multiplication. Because Mother Earth, Mother Nature, I should say, in the grander sense, Mother Nature believes in repetition. Once she masters something, she's going to duplicate it everywhere else. Case in point, a woman's anatomy for giving birth to a child through her uterus, okay, through her vagina. Well, when you look out in the universe, where else do you see that uterus and vagina? We call it stargates. We call it wormholes. We call it hyperspace gateways, all of which represent reincarnation. In the movie Poltergeist, when she went through the wormhole and came out the other side with her daughter, that was a powerful symbolism. Most people didn't realize she was covered in amniotic fluid, as if they just burst through a placenta. And then of course, what do? They stick her in the bathtub of warm water, like you would do with, when a woman's given birth. What's the first thing? Get a bucket of water. Okay, so it was all representative of being reborn. When you pass through a wormhole to go from point A to point B to another part in the galaxy, you are essentially recreating your reality and being reborn into a different quadrant of the galaxy that you've never seen before. All of a sudden, your psychology has to change to handle that. Star Trek Voyager was a perfect example of that. Okay? They get thrown through a wormhole. They come into this delta quadrant that nobody has ever seen before, coming across a gang of, freak show and circus acts like nobody has ever seen in terms of human psychology, and they had to change their whole perception as to how they work together. So, that's what I tell people is look at the new science, stop squandering your time on the corporate rhetoric and propaganda that comes out of the religious sector, because science is proving these things left and right. And the more that we allow them to explore that and you push forward, the more that's going to be a key factor in getting the consciousness and the psychological makeup of the human being to get on board. Right. Most people who deny these things, okay, they're diminishing in number. And those that do are the type that are not exactly psychologically or emotionally stable in the idea of it being true. So it more so comes from once again, that fight or flight reptilian mentality of, I am the master of my own domain. I'm going to take everything that belongs to me because I can only control what's right in front of me. So once again, it's that sense of control. Okay? Right. And that's really what it's all about. And it's like, what the hell do you think you're controlling? All right? You still haven't learned how to manipulate your own reality. You're still taking your commands from the IRS or the Federal Reserve. You're still taking your commands from Washington, D.C. or London or Rome. You still haven't learned how to master your own reality. And that's where that comes from. So go ahead, yeah.
So what do you think is the true nature of our existence on this planet? I mean, is there anything that you've experienced or you've seen that would answer that?
Actually, we started out knowing your past is what gives you your identity. And we started out as what I mentioned before, a grand experiment that evolved out of the idea. And you see this in a lot of different origin stories, and it happens to be true, where Mother Earth was being cultivated as a living library. And the whole idea was, let's see where this goes. Because the benevolent factions that got involved with this, they decided to run this experiment. Let's see where it goes. What would come out of it? Okay. Well, sure enough, eventually, because of that living essence, what evolved out of it by extension were these beings that crawled out of the primordial ooze that all of a sudden, at a certain point in time, began to develop a certain type of psychology of self-awareness and self-determinism. Okay, and this drove the benevolent factions nuts because they couldn't quantify it at the bottom of a test tube. All right, so it became fascinating to them. What way would this psychology go? If we left our hands-off policy, if we left it alone and let it evolve on its own, would the being become a philanthropist or a misanthrope? Okay, would they become a teacher of the masses or an assassin of truth? Which way would they go? So the essence of the human race, our purpose here, was in the grander scope an experiment in humanity to see if Mother Nature would actually replicate herself in this way as we evolved from our primate ancestors, or into our primate ancestors, even before we got into where we are today. And right at that point, we had achieved phase 1 of that. And right at that point when we were going to head into phase 2 of a higher evolution, everything came crashing down, because that's when everybody put the kibosh on it there. So this is why you get these varying opinions of what the essence of our existence is, because it was almost like, here's a good example. Okay, a child driving in the car with their mother or father. They, for some reason, get into a serious, horrendous car accident. All of a sudden, that child is never able to grow any taller than they are, because the shock of the experience stunted their growth pattern. And that is a perfect example of where we are. We were on our way from children to become an evolved adult, and we got into this nasty car accident, and we have been stunted in our growth ever since.
Jeez. Do you, you mentioned earlier the Titans of Orion, I guess corporate Titans of Orion. What's that?
Okay. The corporate Titans of Orion is also known as it's where we get the idea of the two-party system, which is everywhere in our existence. You can't get away from it no matter where you look. And it started with the reptilian queens making a deal with the Canis feudal lords. Okay, now reptilian queens, the Drox, okay, all of them part of the Aryan Empire. I tell people to imagine a bipedal Komodo dragon coming at you. That should be enough to give you nightmares all by itself. But okay, so but on the flip side of that, you have the Canis feudal lords, and it's right in the name, Canis. From the word Canis, we get the word canine, as in dog, and they are basically what we would look to in our superstitions as bipedal werewolves. That's what they look like, okay? And bipedal dogs, bipedal wolves, and these guys are not any better than their counterparts in the Aryan Empire. But they had gone at it with each other, and it was like the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. Neither side was gaining any ground as the two empires were trying to knock the hell out of each other. And they realized that they were, as with any war, which is all based on profit, the only reason that a war comes to an end is when the liabilities outweigh the assets. Okay? When the profit margin starts becoming a little murky and all of a sudden the liabilities and the cost factors start rising, all of a sudden that war comes to an immediate end. And throughout history, this has been the case with every war on this planet, and that's what happened with them too. They realized they weren't getting anywhere, and that it would be smarter for them to work together as two empires to expand their profit margins even further. And that's what they did. That tentative collaboration resulted in what we refer to today as the two-party system, and their expansion of the empire resulted in the Canis feudal lords being given permission to run the operation here in this particular solar system, and as time went on, they are the ones that became the corporate titans and passed on that feudal corporatism to the billionaire boys club that we have on this planet today. The sad part is that these corporate conglomerates, these transnational corporations and pharmaceutical multinationals who take their marching orders from the corporate titans, okay, they seem to think that they're at the top of the food chain because they went to bed with the devil for a piece of the action. The sad part is that, you know, they made their bed and they're going to have to sleep in it now, because when the reality of it comes out, they're in a whole lot of trouble if they cannot keep the human race under control. If they can't keep their ducks in a row, then the reptilian queens are going to get bent out of shape, because all of a sudden the paycheck that goes to the reptilian queens is going to come to a screeching halt. And that's not going to be any good for the corporate conglomerates or the billionaire boys club or the men's only club, okay? Because they're going to come raining down on them like hellfire and fury and wipe the floor up with them and blame it on them, okay? And in which case, that'll be a pretty interesting thing to see how the benevolent factions step in at that point to stop it, because and that's, you know, I point that out in the book too. This is a sad thing. I mean, these people who think they're the privileged ones, they're not privileged, okay? Part of me is laughing at the idea of what's coming for them. Part of me feels bad for them because they have no way out of it. And they basically screwed themselves, their wives, their children, their grandchildren, because for them on the opposite side of the equation, once they ally themselves to that and they become indoctrinated into that, you know, multi-billionaire level there, there's no way for them to get out of that. Okay.
Now, in your book, The Moor, the Mason, and the Alien, is this what you're talking about? Is this what the connection is with the Moorish Legacy and the Masonic agenda?
Yeah, and the reason I named the book as such is because that's the three basic principles or the three basic tenets of what's going on this planet. You have the Moorish Legacy, which represents the spiritual insurrection. You have the Masonic agenda, which represents the corporate titans, okay? And then you have that third silent party there, the alien extraterrestrial intervention, which belongs to the Moorish Legacy, or the alien abduction phenomena, which belongs to the Masonic agenda. Okay?
Jeez.
So there is a difference between the two. I try to let people out there know there is no common ground between what's called extraterrestrial intervention and what's called the alien abduction phenomena. These are two polar opposite entities.
Now, do you think, you know, obviously certain areas of our government, of course, people with a lot of money in this planet are well aware of them, correct?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You know, I mean, that's the only reason why his name escapes me right now, but why the one billionaire has decided to set up the spaceport here in New Mexico. For air travel from Earth to, you know, using the wee upper atmosphere of going into space for faster travel around the planet there. And it's because they've been handed the technology from the military, who in turn got it from whatever they could cobble together from crashed UFOs or what has been handed off to them in a deal that they struck which is a little precarious because we're in a position where Russia being the exception, we'll put them to the side for the time being, but the French, the British, the United States, okay, the Israelis, all right, these governments have mistakenly, all good intentions aside, have mistakenly gone to bed with the enemy for the sole purpose of getting their hands on technology that they think they can use against the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
This started with, the paranoia of the 1950s, with the friction between the U.S. and Russia at the time with the Cold War being manufactured. And Eisenhower, he rejects the first offer that comes that says, you got to get rid of your nuclear weapons if you want to be part of the galactic family. And Eisenhower is like, I can't do that. Well, that's what the bad guys were waiting to hear, because then the bad guys come in and they're like, hey, President Eisenhower, screw those good guys. They're a bunch of spineless wimps. What the hell do they know? We'll show you how to not only keep your nuclear weapons, but how to amp them up even more powerfully. And being stuck in the position he was in, they had him over a barrel. He had to say yes. So, and that's how that started that initiative, because once you get someone, a 5-star general like President Eisenhower from World War II, to say yes to that, well, this just coincides with what I refer to in the book as the ivory tower of Europe, which is one part European invasion, one part alien abduction phenomena. So, and I explain why, on the opposing side is that long ago, our European ancestors made a pact with the Greys. And this is what results in this bloodthirsty lust for conquering the world. All of a sudden, Europe comes out of nowhere as a superpower when it wasn't a superpower. And well, where the hell did they get the technology from? Where did they get the naval fleet from? Where did they get the firepower from and the know-how how to use it? Okay, it was handed to them on a silver platter with what's referred to as the ancient vendetta. And the ancient vendetta is destroy the Moorish legacy, destroy the bloodline of the Christs, destroy the gene for passion, and wipe the floor up with every other dark-skinned culture on the planet. And, of course, that's exactly what happened. The Native American genocide, African Muafa, the Chinese open door policy, that pretty much devastated most of the family of man at that point. In which case, the ancient vendetta proceeded right on from there through into the high priesthood, which we now refer to as the pharmaceutical multinational. And as we all know, the pharmaceuticals have the job of poisoning the gene pool.
Of course, yeah.
And what better way to destroy the Temple of Solomon than to poison the gene pool?
We know you refer to, there's academic and religious perceptions of history in that they're completely inaccurate. What do you mean by that?
Well, we have this academically, we have this warped perception that evolution has all the answers. Okay? And in terms of creationism, we have this warped perception that somehow God has all the answers. All right. Well, if you could get the Darwinists and the creationists to sit down at the same table, they would realize that they are speaking the same language but in two different lexicons. Okay? And that there has always been a third silent party playing both sides against the middle. Evolutionists have been proven dead wrong. From any perspective you take, whether it be genetics, we have a certain number of genetic codes in our chromosomal structure that were side-loaded to us abnormally and don't come from evolution, okay? And in terms of the fossil record, why am I finding transistors and geodes and circuit boards sitting, and capacitors buried in the rock strata right next to my Homo habilis ancestor? Okay? So the fossil record is unreliable. And it doesn't matter if you take it to the perspective that it happened in a concrete manner in terms of linear time or time travel. Regardless of what your argument is, you basically just blew Darwinism right out of the water. Of course, historically, it also doesn't help that Origins of Man, or the book that was written by Darwin was not exactly a stable individual, okay? When you go back and look at what he was doing at the time with that knowledge in terms of his home perception of eugenics, it's like, holy cow, this guy needed to be locked up in a padded room. And of course, it doesn't help that, Adolf Hitler used that book to justify his own Aryan agenda. So,
Right.
all that coinciding, like minds think alike. And on the other side of it, on the flip side, the creationist side, I'll put it out there. Bottom line, we got to stop using this term God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? It is this, and I explain exactly where the word God came from, how it came into existence on behalf of the Canis feudal lords, which aside from the word canine, is also by extension where we get the word cannibalism linguistically. Okay, now if they're the ones that invented the word God, then we're worshiping a bloodthirsty cannibal that is based on profiteering and has no sympathy towards the human race whatsoever. And that's exactly how it took place. On the creationist side, it's completely ass backwards. What was labeled as the devil is perceived as evil. And I explain exactly how the word devil came into existence and who fostered it. And what we refer to as God, not the good guy, bottom line. And as it turns out, God was never all that loving and the devil was never all that bad. And the truth of the matter is that the two of them sleep in the same bed together, tied at the hip in a game of sibling rivalry between two brothers. Of course, the human race is caught right in the middle of that rivalry.
Mm-hmm.
So here we are. Think about this now. Going back to the whole idea of what you reap is what you sow, okay? And what you put out comes back to you tenfold, all right? In terms of spiritualism and metaphysics and the way we think about the world around us, what has happened to the United States economically? We have been downgraded to a third world country in terms of our credit rating. We're no better than Haiti right now in terms of economics and our fiat currency. Now, why did that happen? Well, when you look on the back of every Ford or Chevy truck, you see this dumbass bumper sticker that says, "In God we trust. I love Jesus." Okay, well, you keep bringing all this negativity on you. Okay? It's even on the back of our money, on the back of our coinage, okay? In God we trust. United under one God. God bless America. Well, we've been saying this for the last, 230 years now? And then we wonder why by the year 2000, an imbecile got into the White House illegally and illegitimately, and by the year 2007, the whole entire country went into the toilet, okay, financially speaking. And it's because this is all about economics. Now, we'll go one step further linguistically, okay? There's this agency called GATT, G-A-T-T. You heard a lot about it back in the 90s when it was more public, but now it receded into the background and operates behind the scenes with the World Trade Organization and the World Monetary Fund, okay? They're still there. GATT stands for Global Agency on Trade and Tariffs, something like that, okay? And they're still alive and well. Well, GATT is just simply a variation of GOT, G-O-T-T, which is a variation of God, G-O-D, okay? And GATT is an economic organization working with the World Monetary Fund in terms, and the World Trade Organization, which has its own wonderful agenda on behalf of the shadow government. Now, if that doesn't convince you that this is all about economics and has nothing to do with that comic book mythology we call an all-loving God, then I don't know what will.
So let me ask you this. So you don't believe that there's a creator, or what do you believe?
Well, look at what we've been talking about today. You are the creator.
Okay. Who created us, though?
You created yourself.
How?
That is something that you have to look into. That gets into a whole nother discussion here that I don't have the time to get into. But we are the ones that create our own reality. We are the ones that
Well, yeah,
create them.
I
Yeah.
agree with that. I mean, but I personally, my own personal belief,
Mm-hmm.
based on some of my experiences, that there is a creator that has created all things, but yet we are a fragment and a piece of that creator. So, like if you took an apple, sliced it to 1,000,000 pieces,
Right.
that 1,000,000th individual piece is us, but it's also the creator having experience through us.
And that's
And
fine.
even these alien,
That's
and these
fine.
alien races, some of these alien races speak about that there is a infinite intelligence
Mm-hmm.
that exists, which they are aware of,
That-
but yet some factions believe that these aliens themselves created us, our physical bodies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what do you believe? Do you believe our bodies were created by aliens, by hybrids, or anything like that?
Yeah, engineered, yes. Okay. I believe it's we came to a certain point naturally, and then all of a sudden it was with some cultivation by the benevolent factions, and then all of a sudden the invasion came, and then we were engineered and genetically modified in a different direction.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
As far as the universe goes, yes, there is that collective consciousness, but
Okay.
if you are going to use the word God to describe it, then you are cutting the legs out from under that consciousness and subjecting it to the two-party system and the corporate agenda. Okay.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, between heaven and hell, God,
Yeah.
devil,
So
the Democratic, Republican, all that stuff.
right, and just other examples of the two-party system that exists everywhere in society. You have the Vatican and you have the Israeli Mossad. You have the FDA and the pharmaceuticals. Okay, you got the Federal Reserve and the IRS, corporate conglomerates and media monopolies. So, I mean, you could go all day here pointing out where the two-party system exists on every level of society. And so, yeah, this term, God,
Yeah.
it's a canine term, it's a canis term, and it's an extraterrestrial term that references a militant dictator.
Mm-hmm.
So, you got to figure, at least the Eastern philosophies, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism, they have the right idea. They stay away from that ridiculous term. They refer to it as a concept, an ideal, and they don't use the word God. The only ones that do are the Christians, and that's why they're going to have the hardest time trying to wrap their brain around this one, because of all the centuries that they have been brainwashed and institutionalized to go this way. Like he says in the book Da Vinci Code or Angels and Demons. You guys don't know your history very well, do you? So, and the cardinal is like, please be merciful on us. All right, so. It's like, no mercy here. This is knowledge. This is wisdom. And if wisdom blows your entire Vatican City out of the water, then so be it. Okay? The time is to move away from that.
Yeah, so why do you think that, we're in this constant target of human degradation?
Because the body is the temple, a.k.a. Temple of Sol-Oman, okay? Mm-hmm. Which... translated, when you break the word down, is the frequency and spirit that awakens the beast. Okay? Henceforth the word Adam, and therefore the old high priesthood, the Aman from Egypt. And if the Greys have always been terrified of the gene for passion. Okay? They've always been terrified of it because they can't get to it. They keep seeing everything as a real estate, corporate, commercial commodity that can be controlled and manipulated. So when they had to be confronted with the Temple of Solomon, all of a sudden, their brains, went schizo because it wasn't something they could physically invade and control. It was a spiritual identity that was only meant for the human being internally, because the human body was the Temple of Solomon and is. Well, they understood that part of it at least and realized, okay, all we have to do is target the human being, the human body, the human mind, the human physiology, destroy that from the outside in or the inside out, and hopefully, crossing our fingers, we'll destroy the legacy of the human race by devastating the gene for passion, and therefore the passion of the Christ or the Kundalini or the orgone energy. Mm-hmm. So this is where At a certain point in time, the agenda was put in place for the Greys, a.k.a. the Chetu regime, to then create a shell corporation on two fronts. Okay, one would be, or I should say, three fronts. But the first was, let's get these two suckers, Peter and Paul, to build the Vatican City for us. That became their new haven, and that's the reason why it was built. On the second front, the high priesthood couldn't be called the high priesthood anymore because that would be a dead giveaway. So instead, they've evolved into a newer terminology, which is what the high priesthood was meant for in the first place: food, drug, and water. So they became the pharmaceuticals. And by the time the 1970s came along, the pharmaceutical industry, which started off in the 40s as a mom-and-pop general practitioner of doctors just sharing ideas with each other, much like the evolution of the internet, that by the 70s had evolved to a point where it was a legitimate industry, but then, like with anything, the bad guys moved in. They saw a perfect opportunity to sabotage it and infiltrate it. And at that point, right into the 80s, it became the pharmaceutical multinational, the new high priesthood. And as you look at the paper trail that they've created and the carnage and collateral damage they've left behind, what's their MO? They go and target the less developed countries first, below the equator,
right?
Because who cares about them? And once they successfully master what they're trying to do, then they legitimize it by saying, oh, look, we've had so much success here with these dark-skinned heathens below the equator. It'll work for you, too, above the equator in the more developed countries where all the privileged people are. Let's bring it there, too. And this is where you get all these outbreaks of, ridiculous viruses that never had to exist in the first place, and stuff being mysteriously released from a laboratory into the more developed countries above the equator, all for the sake of creating the politics of fear, which, of course, is psychological warfare against the human mind to create a codependence on the drug factor.
Wow. Yeah, I think well, we all know the pharmaceutical industry and the drugs is that, the lies. They'll say, oh, it'll help you with this. It never says it will cure something, but it says it will help you with this, but it'll cause all these other side effects.
Right.
And they make tons of money off it, and then people die or have overdoses or have all these other problems. The pharmaceuticals are not going to solve the problem. But yet it's a $1 trillion industry. And
they do it the same way that the car industry used to do it in the past and probably still does today. Okay. There was, at the time when certain models of cars were being produced with a vulnerable gas tank in the back, okay, they started realizing that there was a flaw in the design with certain cars where I'll just pick one just for like a Buick, okay, let's just pick one. That every time someone got into an accident and got rear-ended, the car would blow up, okay, kill everybody.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that.
Well, that kept going. Well, the reason they didn't care about it and there was no recall is because the numbers didn't work in their favor. The corporate bean counters said, well, who cares? Let them die. We'll just keep making a profit off the ones we sell, and then when it reaches a certain point where we can't ignore it, then we'll just, pay them off and send them on their merry way. So it's all about numbers, and the pharmaceuticals handle it the same exact way. Okay, it's all about a numbers game. How much profit can we make before the FDA catches up with us and slaps us with some meager fine of what, 50, 100 grand? Wow, they just made $5 trillion. So,
Yep.
It goes one step further than that. They'll actually at that point, just for public relations, okay, because at that point then everybody knows about it. They'll take the drug or the bottle or the pill off the shelf. They'll wait 5 or 10 years, put a new label on it, give it a different name, and stick the same drug back on the shelf again. And that's how that works. That's crazy. Well, I'll tell you, Rich, thanks for speaking with us today. We are running out of time. Oh, yes.
And this has been more than I can handle. Okay. So I'm sure a lot of my listeners are like, holy cow. If you want to know more and you want to go into more details, I do suggest you pick up Richard Smith's book, The Moor, the Mason, and the Alien, A Call to Action, as well as Legions of Light, Armies of Darkness. You can check out his website, ufoteacher.com. As you can see, he's very informative. Also, his other websites, humanoriginsconference.com and richardsmith.com. Check out his books. Check out his website. You can get a hold of him if you have any specific questions. You can reach him on his website or at info@ufoteacher.com. He's also on Twitter at UFOteacher. Rich, I want to thank you for being on the show. We'll probably have to have you on again in the future. Any last words?
Definitely. It's been a pleasure talking with you, Chris. I'd love to come back again. This has been a real treat being on Spirit Talk Radio. And you know what? As they used to say in the 50s, keep looking to the skies.
That's right. Thank you very much. This is Chris Fleming and Richard Smith on this edition of Spirit Talk. See you next month.